Welcome to Don't Say Adulting. It's the show where we seek out advice from friends, family, and professionals on the daily tasks of adulthood. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Don't Say Adulting, podcast hosted by me, where we talk about all the adult problems that we have. I'm joined today by Javi Zubizarreta, our director here, as well as the host of a new podcast here at Grotto called Jesus' Favorite Podcast. Do you want to say a couple words on that?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say it's Jesus' favorite podcast, so for that reason alone, you should listen.
This is his second favorite, by the way. He told me once in a dream.
Jesus' favorite podcast. It launched in the late days of 2023. We are talking to a wide range of people about who they understand Jesus to be, from different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And it's been really fun. We've talked to TikTok famous nuns. We've talked to an exorcist. We've talked to a debt specialist, financial advisor. So relevant to today's topic.
Yeah.
So a lot of really fun people over there. And we have an upcoming show with one of the top finalists from Top Chef. So if you're a fan of I had to think through that there.
Not the top chef, but
one of the top chefs from Top Chef, Kevin Gillespie, who's a really great interview, talking to him about food and faith and more. So check it out. Yeah. It's here on the Grotto feed. So if you're listening to Don't Say Adulting, you can also get Jesus' favorite podcast.
The Exorcist one was great.
I
tried to get in, but I couldn't figure out an adult problem related to,
that adult problem of being possessed by demons,
It usually happens to children in movies, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, that's only for 8-year-olds.
Yeah.
So.
Well, now that you've done the plug. No, I'm kidding.
Enough, please.
No. No, actually, speaking of the financial thing, that's what we're talking about today. Debt. Owing money. Yeah. Kevin owes me money. That's why he's saying it on the record.
That's why he's producing today,
Speaking of things that, really adults deal with, debt is increasingly becoming a problem.
Yes.
I read that in 2023, American consumer debt hit over $17 trillion.
It's a big number.
It's a lot of money that a lot of people are owing, which also shows that it's a very ubiquitous, widespread issue. I think student loans are a big one that face a lot of younger people and increasingly older people.
Yep.
But credit card debt, mortgages actually make up the vast majority of money owed, which makes sense because of the amount and because of the length. But that's becoming a big problem.
Just now becoming a big problem.
When they invented it in 2010, I was like, this is a bad idea. What's your experience?
My relationship with debt?
Yeah.
Gosh. So I come from a more working class family. My dad was a factory worker. My mom was a school teacher. Money was always tight, and it was certainly the one issue that always sort of came to a head for us. And so for me, I've always been afraid of money. I'm not naturally good with numbers. I studied film in college and watched movies. Like I'm not trying to break out a calculator. And so for me in adulthood, I think, I had some student loans that certainly, played a big part in my budgeting. But I think an even bigger issue that I faced is the question of budgeting. Because of my upbringing, I've always just been afraid of money. I've been afraid of looking at my balances. I've been afraid of looking at my credit card statements. And that can get you into trouble if you're not on top of it. And so I think for me, it's definitely been a journey of how do I manage my money and how do I take control of my finances, as opposed to just sort of putting my head under the covers and hoping that they'll go away.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that's that you don't really think about, which is everybody's coming from a different background and understanding of debt and finances. And that really skews your perspective in terms of how comfortable you actually feel taking on loans, or how terrified you are, and how both can be somewhat damaging.
Absolutely.
And so hopefully this episode we can help inform people, myself included. I also came from a fear-based family. Just don't look at money or your credit score.
Yes.
And today we're going to have on Jim Cunningham. He's the assistant program director of the Notre Dame programs for education in prison. And he helps a lot of formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated people learn how to adjust to living outside in the world, taking on loans, taking on debts, avoiding future financial problems.
Yep.
And yeah, I think he's gonna have a lot of great things to say about debt in general for all audiences.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, my goal is that he helps me get out of
personally
the current debt that I'm.
that he lends me some money. No, I'm excited to talk to him.
Me too.
So stick around. We'll be right back here on Don't Say Adulting with Jim Cunningham. Welcome back to Don't Say Adulting. We are now joined by Jim Cunningham, the Assistant Program Director of Notre Dame Programs for Education in Prison. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to just start with maybe a little bit of your background, your experience with, we're talking about debt today and finances and how that all relates?
Sure. So briefly, my background, I've did my MBA here back in 2013. I've worked for the university for the last 10 years in a variety of roles. My experience, my current role as of May with NDPEP, or Notre Dame Programs for Education in Prison, includes alumni in reentry services for our college program. So in conjunction with Holy Cross, we run a college program at Westville Correctional that grants associate's and bachelor's degrees in arts, a nice liberal arts education. My role is to go in and teach workshops regarding life skills, things like employability, financial literacy, etc., and then walking with those alumni on the outside to help them rebuild their lives post-incarceration and help keep them from falling into the trap of debt. And so my experience with debt, three big things shaped my viewpoints on it. The first, I was diagnosed with cancer back in 2003. The second would be the student loans related to Notre Dame and the MBA program. And then lastly, taking out a mortgage on my first home back in 2016.
Yeah, just on that last point, obviously those are all factors, student loan being a big topic these days. I was surprised to learn in my preliminary research that mortgages make up the bulk of consumer debt in America, which makes sense.
Yes.
It's a huge purchase and a very long, like 30 years usually for,
Yes.
How did the other two maybe factor in?
Yeah, and so between mortgages, student loans, and medical debt, those are kind of the big three. And so the medical debt for me, I was actually diagnosed stage 4 at 22.
My word.
And so I wasn't very financially secure at that time. I was working full-time in sales, but I was an independent contractor and therefore did not have employer-sponsored health insurance. So my first week in the hospital 21 years ago was $42,000.
Oh, my God.
And from there, it just kind of ballooned. So, you're getting chemotherapy, you're fighting for your life, and then you're getting calls from collections. I had no income. I had to leave my job, no assets to speak of. And so the way I dealt with that was I contacted my hospital's charity care foundation. Almost all hospitals have this, and for people that can't afford to pay, they actually have an annual budget to help write off these debts. That was extremely helpful. I felt like I had enough on my plate to survive.
Yeah.
And I said if I had the money, trust me, I would make good on it. The remainder of that debt, I lived in Illinois at the time. I applied for Medicaid when I was first hospitalized, got denied, but I won on appeal. And so by getting Medicaid, which is for people with low or no income, I was able to They made it retroactive to the date of my diagnosis, so they were able to go back and cover that debt. But it took quite a bit of legwork. On the student loan front, I applied to school here. I wanted to do the accelerated one-year program. One, because I didn't have to be off of work as much time. I was self-financed. But also because I wanted to get back to work as quick as possible. And so I applied to the program. There's the sticker price, then the fellowship or scholarship that they offer. I actually called the director of admissions and asked for more. Sure. And he ended up bumping it up by 66%. And so, part of managing debt is trying to avoid it. And college scholarships, I think, are great for that. The remainder of it, I graduated with about $60,000 after 1 year. And so I was fortunate. A member of my family, my grandfather, took out a loan in his name for $40,000 of the debt at 3% less. So the government loan on grad loans back then was 7.9, which is pretty significant. He was able to get it for 5, but the caveat was I had to pay it off in 5 years. Instead of the standard 10, now you can get 20-year student loans.
Yeah.
And so my monthly payment was $730, so second only to rent. But it forced me to pay it down in pretty short order.
Yeah.
And then the remaining debt I refinanced through a company called SoFi at SoFi.com. They were able to get a few percentage points off. And so 96 low monthly payments, I was debt-free.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a lot from undergrad. I was first gen, Pell Grant, and so the bulk of the debt was incurred in graduate school.
Yeah, so you mentioned about one of the key things for, getting out of debt is avoiding it in the first place. And we'll stick with student loans for now, but we'll kind of move on to maybe some other things. What are some key things for avoiding that in terms of considering before you enter college and start taking out those loans?
Sure. So specifically at the graduate level, I know this is primarily an undergraduate audience. Think long and hard about what you want to go to graduate school for. I worked in the College of Business here on the graduate side for many years, and I was really struck by how many MBA candidates, Master of Business Administration candidates, would come without a plan for their career, weren't sure what they wanted to do. I would often ask in my interviews, are you running from something or running to something? And so, right now, the 2-year total cost of attendance for the MBA is $180,000. Law school tuition, room and board is $93,000 a year, and that's a 3-year program. And so while I don't discourage doing that, I would say definitely have a plan or a strong idea of what you'd like to do and begin with the end in mind of how will I repay this? What do I want to do? What's the average pay? And so being really intentional, about where you want to go to graduate school and why. I would also say be sensitive to, are you going somewhere that has the best program for you, or is it a name brand thing? I know we love, Notre Dame is both an alma mater or a school, but also as a brand. And so be open-minded to schools that maybe aren't, as well known, but could provide a same quality education.
Yeah.
That bit that you said about, are you running towards something or away from something? I know leaving the undergrad, so many of my friends, myself included, you're trying to figure out what's the next job. You don't know what it is. And so you say, grad school. It'll postpone adulthood.
Yes.
But it sounds like it's...
And adulthood is accruing debt.
Right. And while I don't think, again, grad school is a bad idea in and of itself, if you're using it to delay the real world, that is... I'm trying to think of a more expensive way to do that. And I'm struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And you also mentioned some other, grants, and those are other things to look out for. And in terms of afterwards, refinancing, what does that option look like for people that are dealing with debt, and how feasible is it? How should you pursue it? I know a lot of things people just aren't aware of. Is this something that's just difficult to achieve or just not as well known?
Sure. So refinancing, again, I mentioned my grandfather. I recognize that's coming from a place of privilege that I had someone with access to that capital. As far as SoFi or other refinancing companies, what they're doing is offering just a lower interest rate. And so it's not going to be interest free. You're not going to get out of it but companies you're indebted to want you to take as long as possible to pay back, so you pay as much interest as possible. So with SoFi, I just felt like by saving a couple percentage points and being committed to paying that back, I was able to save a couple $1,000s in interest as far as doing that. So I would encourage people to refinance their student loans where possible. Other loans, you can even renegotiate rates on existing loans. And so the way you would do that is do your homework. Say you're with, Bank A, call banks B, C, and D and see what their offers are. and call up Bank A that you're indebted to and say, look, I have these competing offers. Do you think you could meet me halfway, meet me in the middle? And, make sure you're talking to someone that's either a manager, be polite and respectful, but someone who could make that call. Let them know that you have these other offers and you'd love to stay with them. And if they say, hey, we can't, improve your interest rate, call their bluff and say, I'm happy to refinance with another lender. And by letting them know you have options, you'd often be surprised that they would like you to keep paying interest to them.
Yeah. Even if it's less, they prefer.
Yeah, something's better than nothing, especially if they value customer service.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about your work in prisons. So for me, I don't come from a family where we were super savvy money people. I come from an immigrant family. Money was always just a concern. And the way you're talking about finances and the way when I listen to people talk about finances a lot, it kind of goes over my head. How do you train people in prisons around managing money, financial literacy, and sort of tackling some of these things that, frankly, I think for a lot of people, depending on their cultural competency, it can feel like an impossible task?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm often impressed at the number of people who understand multivariate calculus, but the power of compound interest or keeping a budget, I'm more familiar with that. But if you hand me a graphing calculator, I might use it for an uneven table leg. And so my work with the folks in prison, they're getting a liberal arts education. They're learning things that, a lot of the students did not graduate high school, so they get their GED, then their associates, then their bachelor's. So they're getting a broad-based education, but I like to round that out with these practical life skills. There's a big overlap between poverty and incarceration. And so my goal, in working with this population is to help them avoid pitfalls. One example of that would be predatory lending, payday loans, and explaining and showing interest and having people either do the calculations or watch me do the calculations to see, you think you're borrowing this, but you're going to end up paying this. And people are often shocked, wow, it accrues that quickly. Or people just want to get a car when they get out and have a means of transportation. Well, some of the dealerships will give you a 20% car loan. And so how do you avoid falling prey to people that would take advantage of your situation? Something that's been popping up in the lexicon lately that I've heard is it's very expensive to be poor. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So part of it is avoiding predatory lending. Another part of it is making a budget, sticking to a system. There's a very old system known as the envelope system. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but people before the age of, everything being digital, they would have physical envelopes. They would take the cash that they have to them and say, this is for rent, this is for meals, this is for this, so that they wouldn't overspend in each category, and it forced them to allocate that money. There's actually apps that do that digitally, but that way of thinking, especially for this group of students, kind of blows their minds because it's so simple, but it's so helpful.
Sure.
I also advise against things like gambling or playing the lottery.
Sure.
There's the old adage, the lottery is a tax on people who are not great at math. And so, there's actually a significant portion of the U.S. that, when asked, what is your retirement plan, it's to hit the jackpot.
Sure.
And I just discourage them from that. Not to say nobody wins, but if you're going to put eggs in a basket, I think being realistic and being conservative with how you spend your money is important, especially if you don't have a lot of it to waste.
Yeah. And I imagine, and it's always tough to look towards the future when your current situation seems somewhat dire. But then that kind of perpetuates, the situation.
Yeah, I've been hearing this logic, hashtag something logic, and it's it's not real money if it's this or if it's that. I can assure you it is.
Yeah.
And someone's going to have to pay back that debt. And the concept of retail therapy, I'm guilty of it. If I feel bad sometimes, I might buy something for myself. But I don't want to make a decision on impulse that's going to follow me for years to come.
Yeah. Is there a way to, besides high interest rates, are there other ways to identify predatory loans? Is that the main one? Are there any sneaky clauses they'll slip in?
Well, I do think reading the fine print is very important. I think high interest rates are a big part of it. Now, banks will tell you that to make loans to people with low or no credit scores or high-risk loans that they need a higher rate of return. But again, seeing how much things cost, or how much it'll cost over the life of the loan, a lot of places are obligated to show that to you. And so reading that paperwork, reading the fine print, I think is a huge part of it. I would also say being aware of what's legal and what's not. For example, in most cases, a prepayment penalty is not legal. So some bad actors out there will actually create a financial penalty for paying them off early because, again, they want as much interest as possible. But when you're buying a car or buying a mortgage, that is not, to my knowledge, I'm not an attorney, is not a legal practice.
Oh.
And so just taking the time to review it or having someone else, if you don't understand something, signing it is not a great idea.
And speaking of kind of credit card loans and credit scores, we were kind of talking about that and how unfortunate it is to have your life dictated by a number. But what are ways you can improve a credit score, understand your situation with a certain credit score?
If I could supplement that question, I might even say too, like if you were just starting out after college, what would you say are some of like the best and worst things to do in terms of credit card usage, etc.?
Oh boy. Let me tackle the...
And if I could go back to being 23 and take some notes.
Right? Tell me about it. Yes. The question that you had was about...
Yeah, just improving credit score. We can start with that, though, in terms of before you maybe even having a credit card. Or I mean, I guess it's probably good to have one by then. But
So one thing is taking responsibility by having things in your name. So, a lot of people, especially in more well-off socioeconomic classes, will use their parents' cards for things. And that's fine. But there's really no record of you taking on debt, paying it down. For example, with SoFi and my federal student loan, that was in my name and my name only. And so building the credit score comes from making consistent payments over time, doing what you say you're going to do, not being late with things. By the time I paid off that SoFi loan, I had built a pretty nice credit score for myself. So taking on reasonable levels of debt that you can pay, living within your means, and paying it back with your name and your social security number attached, I think helps build a healthy credit score. And from there, it's again, calculated risk where you can, use credit cards and not all debt is bad. But if you get to the point where you can't pay it back or you're making the minimum payment and it takes 10 years to pay back something, that you could pay back much quicker, that's when people tend to get into trouble. Another big thing that dings your credit score is even when you apply for a loan for something. So if you're applying for car loans all over town, your credit score is going to go down. If you apply for debt consolidation, that dings your credit score. If you file bankruptcy, that kills your credit score. And I mean for a period of, depending on if it's Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, 7 to 10 years. And banks, you're considered radioactive and that they will not touch you for any sizable loan. And that I would see bankruptcy as an option of last resort.
What are some good ways to take on debt in that period when you're trying to build up your credit score?
Well, I think making sure you have an income, making sure you have a job. If credit card, if you're putting, say, something small but manageable on it, maybe it's your internet or some utility or say your mobile phone bill, something that's going to be consistent over time. You don't want something that's very variable, but something that's nominal and that you can pay back. And so you're paying down that balance and not carrying a credit card balance from month to month. I try not to do that. In all but extreme cases, I do. I recently had a baby, and
Congrats.
thank you. I'm realizing the limits of that method. However, I try to take pride in my credit score. Again, we shouldn't be defined by a number, but it impacts our access to education, transportation, housing, all of the things.
Yeah.
The milestones of adulting, if you will.
Yeah. Is this where you might be hesitant of like the Dave Ramsey method? Because I know he's very anti-credit cards because of all the obvious dangers. But it would be tough if you didn't have a credit score necessarily to your name.
Yeah, I've read Dave's books. I've seen some of his YouTube clips. I think there's some validity to his idea of a debt snowball and the idea of needing a budget. But the idea of not having credit cards and being off the grid in that way, for example, Notre Dame is a cashless retail environment.
Yeah,
sure. So how
is
they don't even take cash here.
Yeah.
And so,
how can you support the Irish if you don't have a credit card?
Absolutely. And so with that in mind, I think having access to credit when you need it, but being disciplined and being measured in how you use it and not, splurging on some consumer item, that either rapidly depreciate or you'll enjoy it for a little bit, but then it'll just become normalized to you. I see that happen a lot. And that can really hobble you for when you need the credit. It's not there or you're maxed out because shopping spree.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'm not saying that's all the cases, but that stuff, credit is I think for when you need it more than just when you want something.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about building a budget when you're just getting started? And I think especially if you're just getting that first job, you don't have that savings. Maybe you're moving to a new city, lease, first month's due, last month's due. How do you sort of start that budgeting when you're just beginning?
Believe it or not, budgeting hasn't gotten easier as time has gone on, but the apps to facilitate that process have. And so some that come to mind are YNAB or You Need a Budget. One that I particularly like is Good Budget. And that is an app that's free, but you can go premium with additional features for like $70 a year. And that's actually a digital version of the envelope system.
Okay.
And that it forces you to allocate the money and think through. There's gamification to it, but then also it lets you know, hey, your envelope's empty for this.
Sure.
And so I think just understanding where your money's going, not searching for the perfect budget, but just creating one. And I do want to draw a distinction between like a budget and accounting. So when I started what I thought was budgeting, I was just putting everything on my bank statement on a spreadsheet, but it was all looking back.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so I'm like, wow, I really went crazy with restaurants this month. Well, it's too late to do anything about it. A budget is really forward-looking and saying, I have this amount of money. I'm anticipating these expenses. How much do I have left, and how do it's making a plan for that money and remembering that you can only spend $1 once.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we can shift maybe a little to tackling debt now, we've talked a lot about things you should consider before taking on debt. In the Dave Ramsey vein, we've got the snowball method, which is, from what I understand, tackling the smaller ones, debts, smaller interest rates first, versus the avalanche method, which is the complete opposite. Do you have any thoughts on those two methods, or which one you think is more effective? What the benefits of both might be?
I do. And so the debt snowball, you're correct, involves paying down the smallest balance first. After reading Dave Ramsey's book, my wife and I did take a shot at that early on in our marriage. What's good about the snowball method is you can see progress. If you start paying off, say, the $50,000 student loan, it's hard to feel like you're chipping away at it and it's just a slog. Whereas if you can pay that $500 on the credit card down, you can, you get that I don't want to say instant gratification, but gratification more quickly. And so I think it does save you interest. It's a faster way to pay down the debt. If I had to choose between the snowball and avalanche, I would pick the avalanche. Reason being, in the debt avalanche involves paying down not necessarily the highest balance first, but the highest interest rate first. So with the avalanche, you make the minimum payment on all of your debts except the one with the highest interest, because that's what's accumulating the fastest, and that's what's going to cost you the most in the long run. I like that method because it's going to save you the most in interest, and interest is often what turns a bad debt worse or causes things to become bigger over time. That's kind of, I prefer the avalanche over the snowball. I would recommend either is better than neither, and just kind of scattershot paying stuff. So I think the more instant gratification lies with the snowball, but the more effective method and the way to save the most money is with the avalanche. But it does require discipline and consistency.
So it seems like there's almost a psychological element to the snowball in terms of like when they recommend setting goals really small, so that you actually do them.
Many books have been written on the psychology of debt. One I recommend it's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber.
Okay.
It is fascinating and how even the times before Christ, that was a whole thing, and the way people think about it and the way debt affects the brain, it's fascinating, but it also gives you insight into how your mind works.
Yeah.
Maybe if I could go deeper on that, like, how would you advise someone who either can't stop spending, is afraid of looking at the credit card bill, so they sort of avoid it? Those psychological changes that need to happen, where would you advise someone to start there?
Yeah, I think that's difficult. This is not inappropriate to discuss in therapy. This is something therapists are used to hearing because it could be a sign of something bigger.
Sure.
I think if you're naturally an anxious person, not wanting to open it or not wanting to face it just fans the flames of that anxiety, and it doesn't help, and it can leave you depressed, thinking, there's no way I'm going to get out, so like, why deal with it at all? But to them, I would say, like, it's not going to go away. Student loans are especially sticky, and by that I mean, whereas some personal debt can be absolved through bankruptcy, student loans cannot.
Right.
And that will follow you, forever. And that's not meant to be daunting, but I think once you find the courage to face it and even make some payment, I think there's psychological power in taking action, and trying to face that issue. But I would advise anyone that's feeling anxious about debt or avoiding it. Again, therapists cost money too.
Sure.
But if they can help you, find what the underlying cause of that is about, so that you can address it, I say the only way out of debt is through.
No.
If you're in a position where the debt seems to be getting unmanageable, I've seen options thrown around, obviously bankruptcy being at the worst end, but debt settlement or debt consolidation. What are the difference between these things? Do you think there's ever a position you can be in where it's just not manageable? Would you ever advise any of these options?
Yeah, I think some of the misconceptions about debt is, one, that all debt is bad, but there's also that debt is somehow morally wrong. I don't think that debt in and of itself is morally wrong. I think the key is, are you taking on debt with intention of paying it back, and are you doing what you can? Now, that said, hardships happen. You can be unable to work, you can get laid off. Things can happen that impact your ability to pay back debt. So between debt consolidation, debt settlement, and bankruptcy, I would actually say in that order.
Okay.
And so consolidating debt involves you owe money to, say, 10 different entities. This would be a way of consolidating or bringing together that debt so that you're only writing one, maybe two checks a month to those folks. Because, again, psychologically, getting mail from 10 places, emails from 10 places, that's difficult. And so debt consolidation allows you to, okay, I only have to write these checks or make these payments this month. That's often done. There are agencies that do credit counseling that can help with that. Some are low or no cost, others charge a fee. Another thing with debt consolidation, some people can use this to good effect. I've used this, credit card balance transfers. So every now and then, if you let your junk mail pile up, they'll say, hey, 0% for this amount of time. So if you're paying, say, 20% interest on your credit card, you can transfer that to another card for 0% for a designated period of time. If you pay it off during that time, you're going from paying, tons of interest to none. But the key is, can you pay it in that time? Make sure you're not just using that, again, as a means of avoidance.
Sure.
And so I think debt consolidation is helpful, but again, not the first line of defense. I think more deep than that is a debt settlement, which will absolve you of some of the debt. That is going to ding your credit score. Some of that can be do it yourself. Others, you're going to hire folks. I recommend for that hiring an attorney. But again, you're going to pay attorney fees.
Yeah.
You're going to pay fees to lower the amount of debt owed, and whatever amount of debt is forgiven is taxable. And then lastly, as we call it, the nuclear option is bankruptcy. If it's hopeless and there's no way you're going to get out of it, you can file bankruptcy. It's actually shockingly easy, but the effects of it are very long-lasting. And I think psychologically, that is the most difficult one to deal with. There's two different kinds of bankruptcy you can file. There's a Chapter 7, which eliminates the debt but requires you to give up some form of personal property to be sold off to satisfy the debts. There's a lot of exemptions for that, but that's a pretty severe way. The more common way is Chapter 13, which is either known as wage earners bankruptcy or debt repayment bankruptcy, where they work with you to set up, I would say, 3 to 5 years of regular payments to satisfy that. And after that, say 5 years, the rest of that remaining debt is forgiven. Chapter 13, the one I just mentioned, is going to really kill your credit score for 7 years. Yeah. And Chapter 7, because it's so severe, will do that for 10 years. So your ability to even qualify for a loan or mortgage on a house will be impacted for the next up to a decade. Wow. And that's why I only recommend bankruptcy in the most dire of do anything you can to avoid it. But remember that if student loans are your problem,
it doesn't help.
It doesn't help.
Okay. What happened? Maybe this is kind of a dark question, but one of my coworkers actually asked this question. What happens when you die? Or what happens to a lot of these debts, like student ones, which can't really go away? Where do they go?
Yes, I would say in a lot of cases they're forgiven, and I'm glad you asked this because I didn't want to be macabre in bringing it up. Yeah. But now that you've given me license, I will speak on this.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. So a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of, but many students have parents co-sign on loans. So if your parents co-signed on a student loan and God forbid you die, that amount of the student debt will be forgiven, but it is taxable to your parents. So your parents will pay tax on the student loan amount forgiven after you pass. So not only do they have to deal with the death of a child, they now have what could be a sizable tax bill. That's why student loans, they're good if you need them, but there's no way out. Yeah. But a lot of those other debts will be forgiven, but some bad actors might try to pursue others to collect those debts. But in a lot of cases, it's forgiven. I think it gets more entangled when you're married, but I admittedly don't have specifics on that.
Yeah.
Sure. Well,
not a great sign.
Oh gosh. On the student loan front, I think one we're living in a moment, right, where it's a political issue, and there's been movements where there's been some hope that some will be forgiven, some hasn't. There's uncertainty about it. How would you advise people sort of live through this moment of uncertainty of what may or may not happen to student loans?
That's a great question. So some student loan forgiveness has been enacted.
Right.
I think largely that's been for people who've been victims of diploma mills in the form of for-profit colleges. I think there's other cases where student loan debt can or should be forgiven. I know one of them is the public service loan forgiveness, where you work in the public service for 10 years, any remaining amount is forgiven. But what I would advise someone is, if you're waiting for this to come through and you're making the minimum payment and letting interest accrue, I do not recommend that because, that I believe was part of our current president's agenda coming into office, and much was made about it. There was a lot of hype about it. And politically that was fought very hard not to forgive that. And so, if the president who plans to get this through is having trouble with it, I think it's possible, but it's not. Hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, that's
a great line.
Just do what you can to pay loans in the meantime. If it happens, it's a pleasant surprise. Right. But that conversation began when I and my wife were still in student loan debt. Yeah. But we went about our day and we paid it down as though it wasn't going to happen. We paid it off, and then it was, kind of shot down or severely limited. And so it was kind of like, and when you pay it off and you get that zero balance, we're talking about psychology. Yeah. We had a party. We had a party. We went to dinner. We're like, this is the level of freedom, and it takes time. It took me 8 years. It took my wife 10. And so, but man, when you do get out from under that, there's few feelings of freedom that compare. So, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. But don't stop paying your student loans thinking, there'll be a fix for this, especially with, how slow things are moving.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess to kind of wrap things up here with terms of the light at the end of the tunnel, are there any resources or programs explicitly that you might recommend that are out there that people might not know about with regards to tackling debt?
So I think, again, the Good Budget app, I think is helpful for budgeting to keep you out of debt, but it also keeps you honest about debt repayments. That's an envelope too. The fact that it's free, I think, can help you conceptualize where your money is going, and that's part of the battle. I mentioned SoFi. I'm not sponsored by them, but refinancing my student loan helped tremendously there. They also have a library of information about this. I felt they educated me in addition to refinancing my debt. They also do debt consolidation with pretty competitive rates compared to what you'd be paying on other debts. And then I just think there's a lot of books available on the subject, but, be skeptical, right? Like, don't just pick up any book. I think Dave Ramsey has some good ideas, but a lot of what he does, especially in the media, is entertainment. Sure. And so I would say, there's never been more information available on how to manage debt, but it's also, we're living at a point where it is so difficult to resist the consumerism in society. I'm not getting on a soapbox here, no. But it's never been easier to spend your money. Yep. Yeah. And I say that from Amazon one click to, cashless retail environments. Yeah. I'm saying that quietly.
Or even some of the programs to help people get out of debt. You've mentioned a lot, like having to pay for all these other things, attorneys.
Sure. And on that credit card balance transfer, they want 3 to 5% of the balance being transferred. Yeah. So there's a fee. It's just having a calculator, having enough knowledge, to be dangerous, asking questions if you don't know. Again, not likely to have access to a financial planner early on in life, but there are tons of free resources out there. FDIC, the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation, they insure savings accounts in response to the Great Depression. It used to be insuring accounts up to $100,000. Now it's up to $250,000. They've developed a financial literacy program called Money Smart. It's all for free online, and it's worksheets, PowerPoint decks. I'm talking the whole thing, and there's entire things written by people on how to get out of debt, how to manage debt, the philosophies behind it. It's very comprehensive. It's elements of that course I plan on teaching to the men at Westville. And so, again, the resources are out there, but I want to acknowledge that it's so easy. Grubhub and GoPuff. I've had ice cream delivered to my house with an element of shame.
Sure.
But I'm like, it's 30 below. I'm getting ice cream delivered. But conversely, I know that I can pay that at the end of the month. But these frictionless transactions make it tough.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing all of this information. I think, we were talking about this, especially now, a really important topic to address and for young people. And it seems like, and increasingly older people are really tacked with a lot of debt.
Scary fun fact that I'll leave with you guys with. The most growing segment of student loans age segment going into delinquency is now senior citizens.
Wow.
Wow, that is kind of terrifying.
So,
I think, though, that some of the things you've identified as like ways to get out, ways to move forward, like are really good things in general to develop, of like monitoring your consumption, like, and that transcends just debt. You think about the environment, you think about our culture, like they're
eating, drinking, exercising, moderation, balance, not deprivation, but indulgence or excess will cost you.
Yeah.
And, the companies involved in this work are it's kind of designed to do that.
They're really good at it.
It's countercultural almost not to be in debt or to manage your debt. And so I would encourage you to, in that regard, to fight the power.
To be countercultural.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you
for coming on. This has been Don't Say Adulting. And we'll see you guys next time with more topics related to adulthood.
Don't Say Adulting is a Grotto Network podcast produced by Jane O'Connor, Kevin DeClute, and Josh Long. Additional production and editing done by Kevin DeClute. Graphics and animation by Becky Rogers. Grotto Network is Director Javi Zubizarreta, Senior Producer Josh Long, Senior Content Editor Jesse McCartney, Art Director Becky Rogers, Senior Manager for Community Engagement Mike Rossetti, Social Media Manager Adrian Garaldi, Web Content Strategist Michaela Douglas, Producer Kevin DeClute, Associate Producer Jane O'Connor. Special thanks to our guest and Notre Dame Studios.